Welcome to Sexology, a podcast that untangles the science of sex and pleasure. And now, with this week's episode, your host, clinical psychologist, Dr. Nazanin Moali.
Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Sexology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nazanin Moali. Today, we're going to talk about sex and porn addiction from a woman's perspective, someone who recovered from sexual addiction. And she's an excellent writer, but yes, I know she's not a scientist, she's not a researcher or psychologist, a therapist. The reason I have her on, although I emphasize using of exploring a scientific approach to sexuality, is that I got so many emails from you guys that you wanted to more about stories of people's challenges, their approaches to sexuality. And of course, as a psychologist and a therapist, I can now provide you guys with the stories of my clients that would be unethical. And I would be happy to talk about my own sexuality, but that might resonate with small part of my listeners. So I thought it would be a better way of having authors on the show that they wrote about their sexuality and they're open about talking about it. So you guys can hear their stories and see if that resonates with you. Of course, we're not going to do it every episode and we're just going to do it every few months, but I thought it would be an interesting change. Please let me know if this is something that you guys find helpful. You want more or less of these kinds of episodes. Our guest today is Erica Garza. She's an author of Getting Off book. She was born in Los Angeles to Mexican parents. She has spent most of her adult life traveling and living abroad. She currently lives in LA with her husband and her daughter. Erica's essays have appeared in Salon, Narratively, Bustle, Marie Claire, and a bunch of other publications and journals. She appeared as a guest on BBC Radio 4, Thom Hartmann's The Big Picture, and again, other podcasts, other shows. In 2010, she earned her MFA in Creative Nonfiction at Columbia University. Her memoir on sex addiction, Getting Off, is her first book. So I read her book. It's fantastic. It gives us such an honest narrative to a woman's challenge with sexuality and sexual addiction. So if that's something you guys want to learn more about, I highly encourage you to check out her book. The other thing I want to remind you that, I'm not against pornography. I don't think every single person who watches porn is a porn addict, because I certainly hear that among the couples that are coming into my practice, that one of the partners are watching porn, the other partner, he or she doesn't like it, and they kind of accuse of the partner as being a sex addict. But when we're talking about it, it just appears that there's a value discrepancy between partners. So sexual addiction, it is a specific term that defines sets of different symptoms and disorder kind of behaviors. And we have Duane Osterlund in a few episodes back that he talked about what is a sexual addiction and what recovery looks like. So if you guys want to learn more about that, I encourage you guys to check out that episode. Anyhow, without further ado, here's my interview with Erica Garza. Hello and welcome to another episode of Sexology Podcast. As I mentioned during the introduction, I'm so excited to have the author of Getting Off, Erica Garza, in our show today. Erica, welcome to our show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I loved your book. I was talking about it in the introduction, and I feel it's very courageous of you to talk openly about sex, because there's just, in our society, unfortunately, there's so many negativity around sexuality. And then I've seen your book has been very well received, and I've seen that you've been in multiple TV interviews and TV shows with huge audiences. And I just wanted to know that how is it to talk about your sex life openly? And also, why did you decide to share your story with others?
I shared it for a number of reasons. But first of all, I felt like there's nothing more empowering than being able to talk about something that you've kept secret for a long time. And when I was in the early stages of my recovery, I was getting gradually more comfortable with being able to talk about these things because I had felt so ashamed for a long time about my sexuality. And I don't think anything fuels shame more than silence. And so I really felt like it was something I needed to talk about. And I had been getting gradually more comfortable in safer spaces like 12-step meetings and in talk therapy, traditional talk therapy. And I had revealed it to my partner at the time, who's now my husband. So I was gradually talking about these things and it was getting easier and easier. But the last frontier was, taking it to a public space. So I started writing about it back in 2014, and I did it with an essay that I published online called Tales of a Female Sex Addict. And the response I got from that one essay was so overwhelmingly positive. And it was from people who had felt like they were the only ones going through this for a really long time. And I knew what that felt like to feel that alone. And so when I heard from them, I felt like this is something that could actually help other people, and I could be making a contribution that matters. And I really wanted to do something that would help other people feel like it's okay to be going through what you're going through. I've been there and I've gotten through it. And it felt like something that mattered.
Right. And I feel one thing that you did, which was fantastic, giving the voice to women who are struggling with sexual addiction and sexual compulsivity, because we have few movies, we have like some images that we see in different shows of what sexual addiction looks like, which is usually a middle-aged man, or Caucasian man that's struggling with it. And you're talking about in the book about your struggle of being a ethnic minority and also a female. And I think that was fantastic.
Yeah, I wanted to show that sex addiction can affect anybody, men and women, any ethnicity, whatever kind of background you grew up with. I think that there is one common narrative, as you say, there's a middle-aged white man. And then when it comes to women, the story is that, it was, the woman must have been abused or raped, or, there must be this significant trauma that took place. It was important for me to show in my book that this can be much more diverse and that the conversation needs to be bigger and to include more people. Because what ends up happening is that if you're going through this struggle and your story doesn't fit what you think it's supposed to look like, then that just adds an extra layer of shame. And then you feel like, okay, well, I shouldn't talk about this. It doesn't matter. There must be something wrong with me alone. And then that leads to just more shame and more silence. And then you don't seek help. So I was really trying to broaden the conversation with my story.
Right. And also, when I was reading your book and about your background, it was similar to many people that I know, many of my clients, and even myself, that women, not necessarily, nothing traumatic, it seems like, in a sense of big T trauma happened to you. It's when we hear like sexual addiction, even my colleagues, other therapists, other psychologists, they think about child abuse. They think about this like huge trauma of like, like so-and-so, like parents who committed suicide, something drastic like that. But in your book, you were talking about how it can happen to anyone with any kind of a life experiences.
Absolutely. And trauma can be ordinary trauma. Everybody goes through pain and everybody goes through struggles. And it doesn't mean that your pain is any less significant, and it doesn't mean that your addiction isn't something that's real and doesn't have real consequences for your life and for your happiness. I think it's important to include more stories so that more people feel like their story matters and that they are worthy of being listened to and getting help.
Right. Another thing is you were talking about in your book about how your porn obsession, I was just kind of like curious about that. How do you kind of make sense of about how your porn obsession started and how did it turn to an addiction? Because I feel for young adults, for teens, it's kind of common to be curious about pornography and some people kind of explore it and it's not necessarily turning to addiction. So I appreciate if you share your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And I did want to make certainly clear in the book that this is not an anti-porn book. Yes, I had an issue with porn, but a lot of people can watch porn in a healthy way. Just like some people can have a few glasses of wine and they don't need the whole bottle. But the way that it worked for me was it started off really innocently. I started watching when I was 12, and the internet wasn't not around then, not the way that it is now. So there were no streaming porn sites or anything like that. So the way that it worked for me is I started watching on cable TV late at night when my parents were asleep, just very mild softcore pornography. And I wanted to watch it a lot because it was exciting and it was curious and I liked the way it made my body feel. In retrospect, all of that I think is very normal to have that kind of curiosity and that kind of interest and want to watch it all the time. But what shifted for me was that not long after I made that discovery, and I had also discovered masturbation around the same time as that. Not long after those discoveries, I was diagnosed with scoliosis and I had to wear a back brace for 2 years. And that's when I started to feel very insecure, self-conscious. I didn't want the other kids to make fun of me. I was afraid of social rejection and I became very paranoid and worried. And the way that I dealt with those worries was that I would watch more softcore porn at night and I would masturbate more. And those were ways that I could effectively escape those big, scary feelings that I didn't know how to handle on my own in a healthy way. And I came to rely on masturbating and watching porn. And not long after all of that, then the internet came into the play. And so I was able to access chat rooms where I could talk to other people about sex. And then I could download pictures. And then streaming porn became available. So every time that I feel like I may have gotten over using sexuality as a crutch, then the internet only became more faster and more accessible. And I felt like I had endless resource to keep up with my habit.
Right. And the other thing is about the internet that you were talking about. I think these days, especially these days with internet and like streaming pornography, it can make it very challenging for people who have vulnerability to addiction to have the behavior under control. Because when you're looking at when like in the past, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people were just going through Playboy or Penthouse. Mm-hmm. There was a couple of pictures. You were looking at the pictures and that you didn't have more. But these days with pornography, you watch something and immediately you get recommendation for 20 other very similar things that's can be part of your erotic template. And it's easier for people to get hooked.
Yeah, and then it's very hard to turn away, as you say, because it's just endless. You can just keep clicking, and then there's the problem of becoming desensitized to something that you may like, and so then having to find more and more extreme and hardcore scenes that you may not have previously liked. And for me, it was a gradual progression because I just didn't have access. So I can't imagine what it may feel like for a young person today to come across those images. And that's why I think it's really important for parents or, even teachers maybe to speak to young people about pornography, because it's something they're going to deal with in a way that we didn't deal with when we were younger. And it's something important I think needs to be talked about. People aren't talking about it enough.
And you talked about desensitization, which is a very important, I think, topic. Do you find that when people kind of watching porn, or maybe based on your experience, that people's kind of erotic template, things that's arousing to them might change?
I do, yeah. I think that your interests become more niche and you may need, more hardcore, as I say, or extreme scenes to become aroused. But it's something that, I try to be really careful when I approach this topic because I don't want to cast judgment on what other people find arousing or not. I think that, human sexuality and desire is all very complex. And as long as there's something happening between two consenting adults, I certainly don't want to cast judgment on that. But for me, I felt like I was starting to watch scenes that sort of disgusted me almost or shocked me. That was such and also made me feel ashamed because when I first masturbated and felt pleasure, I felt really ashamed about it. And I feel like I needed that component of shame going forward in the scenes that I would watch and in the partners I would choose in my life because I needed to have the shame with the pleasure. It became a combination that I came to rely on. And I'm not sure that would have happened if I hadn't started watching porn and relying on porn so early.
Right. And you talked about sexual shame overall. So what do you see is the connection between sexual shame and addiction?
I think that the shame came about because when I first started masturbating, after, the obvious pleasure that I felt that huge sense of shame and guilt only because I didn't know that what I was doing was normal and what I was feeling was normal and that it was okay to feel pleasure. I was raised in a Catholic Latino household and nobody ever talked about sex, and they certainly did not talk about masturbation. And when it came to school, then it was the same story of a man. Sex is something happens between a man and a woman and who are married, and it's for procreation alone. There was no discussion of masturbation or pornography. Obviously, there was no talk of sex outside of marriage and the pleasure side of it. And I feel like those are really important points to make, because when you are exploring those things that don't fit within marriage for procreation, then you feel like what you're doing is automatically bad. And so that shame part of my sexuality, I feel, was the most destructive part about it. And like I said, I started to watch porn that made me feel ashamed. And that meant more degrading scenes, hardcore scenes. And then I would seek partners who would treat me in a negative way because I needed to feel that shame in order to feel the pleasure. They became intertwined with each other, and I didn't know how to separate them. And I often wonder, would that have happened if I just felt like what I was going through was normal and if people had talked to me about it in the beginning?
Right. As you were talking about shame and addiction, I was thinking about something that I notice a lot between my clients, like the stories they're telling me. And also, I'm coming from a very conservative background, and based on I hear stories of my friends, and even partly my story of growing up, that parents want to protect their children, and then they and also the culture and society and religion, and then they put so much negativity toward sexuality. And I have parents punishing their kids when they were catch them masturbating, and I think that can be very destructive.
Sure. I think parents need to be a safe space for their children to go to with these questions and feel like they can speak openly with their parents. And, I know that may not be a comfortable conversation for any parent to have with their children, and especially if they're coming from a lineage as well where their parents didn't speak to them. But that cycle it doesn't serve anybody. And then what ends up happening a lot of times is that kids may end up watching porn or going out with somebody and doing things that they're not really comfortable with, or they don't feel like they actually want to do, but they don't have any other reference points to talk about this. So they just keep doing it anyway because they think that's what they're supposed to do, or that's what sex looks like. So I think that sex can become very performative, and it also can be quite destructive and dangerous. And, kids will start having unprotected sex, and all sorts of, negative things could happen and could have been prevented if they just felt like they had a safe place to turn to talk about these things before they engaged.
Right. And also you're right about lack of sex education. I feel these days, many of the teens, they learn about sex through pornography. And again, like you, I'm not against pornography. I think it can be a good entertainment if it's been used in a contained way. But I feel like, it's not a sex education. And many people use it as sex ed, and then they kind of have an idea what sex looks like. They think they need to have certain kind of body, have certain kind of attitude, but they never learn how to feel sexy and how sexy feels like. And I think that's an issue.
Yes, I agree with you on that.
The other thing is you were talking about how, our sexuality can be broad. I agree with you on that. And again, specifically, if you're engaging in certain kind of sexual behavior that's consensual, and it's not normative, at least what you kind of consider normal in the population, there might be nothing wrong with that. But I'm kind of curious to learn from you about how did your journey of recovery started?
So when I was in my mid-20s, I think is when I first started to question whether or not I had an issue with sex, and maybe sex addiction or porn addiction. I had been using it a lot, and I felt like I was sabotaging a lot of my relationships, and I was feeling really stuck and repeating the same patterns and lonely. And there was one relationship in particular, one that I really valued the person, and I felt like he valued me, and this could be love and we could get married. But I sabotaged that relationship because I just didn't feel worthy of love. And it was much easier to just stay by myself and these casual, no strings attached relationships and soothe myself with porn and just keep going down that path. but it also felt like it wasn't serving me anymore. And I was becoming much more aware of that. And it was hard to just shut off the reality of that. And my 30th birthday was coming up. So yeah, this was my late 20s. So my 30th birthday was coming up. And I thought, okay, I've got to do things differently, or this decade's going to be just like the last. And I don't want to do this anymore. I want to feel like I can change and be different and be better for myself. And so I took this trip to Bali because I had heard that it was really affordable, and I knew there was a lot of yoga and meditation and healing centers. And I just sort of wanted to take care of myself and do something different and go on a journey and be on my own. So I went to this place and I started to really pay attention to what was happening in my head and what had happened to me so far and why I was so unhappy. And when I was in this clear-headed space of taking care of myself and intending to change, I met my husband, and he was on his own path of recovery, recovering from drug addiction. And we just were able to kind of hold each other in this space of wanting to support each other and listen to each other. And it was the first relationship where I was able to reveal to somebody that I thought I may be a sex addict and a porn addict. And it was always the most scariest thing. I didn't want somebody to find out about me. But when I revealed that to him, he was incredibly supportive and he didn't run away. And I thought, wow, this feels so good to be able to reveal something so real and to allow myself to be this honest and vulnerable with another person and be listened to. And it felt like it was something I needed to be working on in my life. And that's really when the shift happened for me. And I started to go to 12-step meetings after that. And I started to do some talk therapy. I did something called the Hartmann process. I started writing about my journey. It was so important for me to show in this book that recovery isn't just one thing, that sometimes it takes trying a lot of different things to find out what works for you. And I often thought that, I was searching for the one solution, not realizing that it was the combination of those efforts that ended up helping me in the end. And that it was the persistence to keep trying new things to find that I was gradually changing and stepping into, a more positive direction. And it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that you continuously work at. But I do feel like I'm in a much better place that I am today than before, for sure.
Right. And I love that you took time to kind of explore with yourself and kind of reflecting on whether this is an issue for you or not. And also you felt comfortable to talking about it with your husband and I would imagine then boyfriend. What made you feel comfortable disclosing to him? Because I know that can be very tricky and it is such a vulnerable thing to talk about it with other people.
He was just the kind of person that encouraged me, that could catch when I was holding back and encourage me to say more and to reveal more and to listen intently without judgment and criticism. And, I may have come across people like that in my past as well, but I was not ready in the past. So I do feel like it was the readiness, it was the willingness to change and to want to do better for myself and to love myself and to let love into my life. I think I needed that desire in order to meet somebody and let somebody in my life who would be healthy for me like that. It starts with yourself and the ability, the desire to change and grow.
Right. And showing your vulnerability with someone can truly deepen the intimacy. And I think it was wonderful that he was getting the process of recovery himself because of it seems like he was in his own journey of recovery also. And the other thing I was thinking about is that some of my clients that they do wonderful work of processing their past around sexuality. For those of them that they struggle with sexual addiction, they tell me that when the relationship deepens, they lose interest in their partner because they need those kind of excitement, early stages of excitement. Was that something that you noticed?
Not so much. I know that can happen for other people, but the thing for me is that I was so hungry for intimacy for a long time. And I think, even when I was trying to keep things really no strings attached and casual and keep things really loose with other people, what I really wanted for so many years was just connection with other people and intimacy. So when I met him and revealed these things about myself and allowed myself to get vulnerable and let him see who I really was, it just it was such a life-changing thing for me that I didn't want to risk that or throw that away. And I didn't really have a desire to destroy things because I had been destroying and sabotaging relationships for so long. It just wasn't part of me anymore. So that wasn't so much an issue.
Great. So from what I'm hearing, it seems like you wanting to have connection. It was a big part of it was a value for you. And I think you were able to fulfill that by being truly intimate emotionally with your husband. The other thing that I really enjoy hearing is about your story of recovery that you talked about. Yes, you had this realization, you did 12 steps and also talk therapy. So you tried a number of different things. And what I notice is at times people kind of try one single thing and it's not for them. And they totally kind of like give up on recovery. So it's wonderful to hear that you created your own kind of treatment plan and things that you found helpful. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, I think it's a necessary thing to do, is to search what do you like and what sorts of things do you like, and what kind of person you are, because it doesn't really fit to just choose one path. Say this one path is for every person. 12 step, that's all you need. That might not work for a person. That might not be something that is important to you. If you go to a 12-step meeting, you might be turned off by something and then you feel like, okay, well, I tried it, so that didn't work. I'm just going to go back to doing what I was doing. I think it's really important to keep searching and see what works for you. And yes, to be creative about it and to make a treatment plan that works for you.
Excellent. So I bet that your listeners want to check out the book and your other writings, our listeners. And please tell us where they can find your information, your writing, link to the book.
You can go to my website, which is ericagarza.com, and my book is on sale there. I also have my essays there, or you can go to Barnes & Noble, it's for sale, and Amazon. There's also a lot of independent booksellers that are selling the book as well. But my website is a good place to find not just the book, but also contact me. And I love hearing from people who are struggling, and I try to respond to every person that contacts me, because it's important to have that kind of connection. And I'm always happy to reach out and help people.
Erica, thank you so much for giving a voice to women's struggles with pornography and addiction and being so brave. And I bet our listeners would love to contact you. I leave the link to the show notes. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Erica. I really appreciated her honest reflection on her journey of recovery and sharing with us what worked for her. If you notice that there is an issue around your sexuality, if you feel sexuality is more as a way of acting out for you, and there is this compulsivity associated with that, I encourage you to reach out and get help. One thing at time that I notice with my clients, that they notice there's a problem in their sexual behaviors. Perhaps they're spending hours in front of porn, watching porn and masturbating, and they're not doing their daily responsibilities, or at times they go to massage parlors and it causes them to have issue in their family life, at work. They go to 12-step programs and they feel, the stories of these people are really acute. That's not my story. Then as a result, I'm not a sex addict, or this is not an issue for me. I encourage you to think about sexual addiction and sexual compulsivity in a continuum. You might not be at the end of continuum as far as getting in legal problem and having major life consequences. But if you are struggling, if you feel your sexual acting out behavior is getting in the way of the life that you want to live, getting in the way of your relationships, getting in the way of you completing the job that you love, I encourage you to reach out for help. If you're in LA, I can certainly help you. I have some training in sexual addiction treatment. Or if you're other part of country, there are wonderful therapists that are trained in providing treatment. I would be happy to provide you with their information. Anyhow, I'll talk to you guys next week. Thanks for listening to Sexology Podcast. For more great content, visit www.sexologypodcast.com. Please be advised that information presented on this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health provider.